Welcome, everyone. Adam Lafaci, your moderator, rejoining you, and thanking you for joining us for today's American Alliance of Museums webinar. Today's topic is Required Elements of a Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Response Plan. And I'm joining you from Learning Times, and we are proud to be producing and sponsoring this webinar today and this series with the American Alliance of Museums. I'm joined by Greg Stevens, who is joining us from the American Alliance of Museums as my co-moderator. And Greg, would you like to say hi?
Thanks, Adam, and thank you all for joining us today.
Great. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to cover a few technical aspects of the online room with everyone. Starting off, you'll notice that we have live closed captioning down at the bottom of the screen, courtesy of our friends at WGBH in Boston. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully that is useful to all of you watching the webinar today. Now, if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat box on the left side of the screen. And if you have technical questions, I'll respond to you privately so that we can get those sorted out as quickly as possible. And if you have content-related questions, we'll be tracking those and taking note of them as we go. So if it gets lost in the flow of chat, don't worry about it. We'll make sure to address as many of the questions as we can. Now, we'd like to get to know a little bit more about you before we start. And I see some people have typed in a greeting in the chat box, so please feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourselves there. And we would like to know how many people are watching this webinar with you from your location. And you'll notice that you can click on the gray bubble that best corresponds to the number of people who are sitting with you. And it's great to see that so many people are dealing with good weather today. And thanks for coming indoors to join us for the webinar. Though it looks like Veronica in Denver might be staying inside anyway. Sorry to hear it's still snowy in Denver. Great, and I'll move that poll to the left corner of the screen so you can continue to respond if you haven't had an opportunity to yet. And as you're putting in those answers, I'm going to turn the floor over to Greg so that he can introduce today's presenters.
Thanks very much, Adam, and it's my pleasure to be here with some fine colleagues for today's program about disaster preparedness and emergency response plans. I'd first like to welcome my colleague down the hall, Cecilia Walls, who is the accreditation coordinator here at the Alliance. And I'd also like to welcome Elise Lecomte, the registrar and assistant department chair at the Department of Natural History at the Florida Museum of Natural History. Elise, thanks for joining us today. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Doug Alves, the director of the Calvert Marine Museum. Known Doug for quite a few years and very glad to be working with you again, Doug.
It's great to be here.
Yes, this is Elise. I'll second that. I'm glad to be here on doing another webinar.
Great. Thank you both very much. And I'm going to turn the stage over to Cecilia, who's going to talk a little bit about this program in the context of our larger core documents verification program. Cecilia.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome to everyone in the audience. We're so glad that you joined us today. And to my co-presenters, Doug and Elise, I think it's going to be a great presentation. Today's webinar is one in a 5-part series related to the Core Documents Verification Program. And this new program is one step on the continuum of excellence, which is portrayed in this lovely visual right here. The Core Documents Verification Program is meant to help museums keep their documentation up to date through an outside review of your documents. It helps provide both accountability and confirmation that you're on the right track, and it distinguishes your museum as a professional member of the field. So it also streamlines your path towards accreditation, as it is a new prerequisite for accreditation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Core Documents Verification Program. Those are all the things that it does for the museum. These are the 5 documents that we review through the Core Documents Verification Program: the Educational Mission, Institutional Code of Ethics, Strategic Institutional Plan, emergency disaster preparedness and recovery plan, and the collections management policy. And because preparing for disaster is one of the most vital responsibilities that a museum can undertake, it has been designated as the preparedness plan has been designated as a core document. So after 40 years of reviewing museum documentation in the accreditation program, the Alliance identified these 5 documents as fundamental for the basic professional museum operations because they embody core museum values and practices. And any museum, regardless of size or type, can prepare and have these documents ready, and it helps codify and guide your decisions as an institution. So our purpose in developing the program is to confirm that the institution has the educational mission and policies and procedures in place to reflect standard practices of professional museums. And in today's program, we are going to, of course, talk about the Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Response Plan. We'll touch on the required elements that we've developed for this particular document, how this plan can be used as a tool, and how it can relate to the institution's entire operations. We'll also provide you with some resources that you can use in either revising or developing your own plan for your institution. So what we hope you will get out of this program is to determine whether or not your own plan meets the national standards as they are disseminated by the Alliance, and help you find some resources that can help you either create or strengthen your plan. I'm going to turn the stage over to Elise to talk about what a disaster preparedness and emergency response plan is.
Thanks, Cecilia. Well, as Cecilia mentioned, it's one of the most important plans or policies that you can have for your museum. The purpose of an emergency preparedness plan is to safeguard the collections, to protect staff and visitors, and to preserve crucial business and operational functions. Now, it's a written document, and I think, does the next slide, Cecilia, have the words circled? Yes. So a written document is necessary because once it's in writing, it helps to prevent ambiguity, it provides accountability, and it promotes consistency. An effective emergency preparedness plan, or as we commonly call it, a disaster plan, helps prevent or minimize damage resulting from emergencies or man-made or natural disasters. So it allows a museum to react calmly and efficiently to emergencies and to prepare efficiently for impending disasters. It also serves to help the museum recover quickly and effectively from emergencies or disasters. So in general, a disaster plan is comprehensive, but it also needs to be simple and flexible and easy enough to follow during an emergency. The plan should be tailored to the museum's specific circumstances and facilities and should cover all relevant threats or risks to the museum, its collections, and its people. This can include evacuation plans for staff and visitors and plans for how to protect or recover the collections in the event of a disaster. The plan should also outline the responsibilities of each involved party. I'm going to turn it back to Cecilia now.
Thank you, Elise, for that very succinct definition of what a disaster preparedness plan is. And now I think, Doug, you're going to handle this audience question.
Well, do you have a disaster preparedness and emergency response plan already? So we could have a vote, yes, no, progress, to get some idea of how many folks are in the middle of this, completely confused.
Well, it looks like either almost everybody either has one or is working on one. So that's a great statistic there.
Well, and as we're looking at the responses for a moment, I think it might be interesting to know for those 10% or so folks who do not have a plan like this in place, I'm wondering why, or maybe you're just getting started in your institution or some other reason. And maybe for those 40% who are in process, what does that mean? Where are you in that process, perhaps? If you can respond in the chat box on the left.
Because if you hadn't had a disaster yet, you will at some point.
Be it minor or major. I see a new museum that would, yeah, definitely be working on it.
One of the things that we found in Florida, we did a statewide survey here as part of the National Connecting to Collections program, and we found out that the thing that museum people wanted the most was help with developing an emergency plan. So during the second year of our program, we developed this 9-month program. We did 3 workshops, and the goal was at the end of the 3rd workshop to have at least a draft of the plan. And that has been working very effectively. We completed that program last year, and it was very successful.
And I believe copies of disaster plans are available from AAM as well as some other institutions. Being part of a maritime museum, the Council of American Maritime Museums, most of our museums are on the water, and worrying about flooding and hurricanes has led that group with CAM to have emergency plans for years, and everyone's always willing to share.
Yeah, that's great, Doug.
Well, I see a lot of the folks in our chat boxes are in process of some sort, gathering information, just getting started. They have one, but it needs to be revised. One that's been in draft for about 15 years.
And that's the case in a lot of museums, I think.
Yeah. No, this is very interesting. Well, yeah. I hope you all will continue putting your comments in as we move along to our next section.
Yeah. We're going to talk about, there are some quick and dirty tools out there for museums that you can use. Actually, some of them come from the archival profession, but can be adapted for museum use as well. And these are great tools to use in an emergency, but they should not and do not replace the need for an institution's comprehensive institution-specific disaster preparedness and response plan. But these 3 tools, and there are others out there, are the Pocket Response Plan, which is a very small little flip through that you can pull out and fits in your pocket. It's really easy to use, and you just fill in the information. And that comes from the Council of State Archivists. The Heritage Preservation has the Emergency Response and Salvage Wheel, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It is now available as an app, a free mobile app, for those of you who would like that. And then the Northeast Document Conservation Center has D-Plan, which is an extremely comprehensive template for a disaster plan. But as I said, these should not replace the museum's process for developing its own institution-specific plan. But we wanted to make you aware of these resources in case you can use them as tools in your organization. And now we're going to talk about why a disaster preparedness and emergency response plan is so important. Elise?
Thank you, Cecilia. Museums care for resources that are held in trust for the public, and therefore they need to minimize the risk to these resources. So having a strong disaster plan helps the museum safeguard its building, its collection, its staff, its visitors, and even its surrounding neighbors. The plan also has financial implications that include things like insurance, conservation costs involved with salvage of collections, of buildings, and other institutional resources. And it also contains contingencies to cope with the possible loss of things like operating revenue. So the process of creating and implementing the plan can be as much, if not more, beneficial than the actual plan itself. I've seen a number of examples where the process of creating the plan brings the different divisions of the museum together, brings in outside resources, and really helps make the museum's response to disaster stronger in the long run. Thanks, Cecilia.
Thanks, Elise. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the specific standards that relate to disaster planning. And these standards are covered in the Facilities and Risk Management Standards that are the field-wide standards, but they're gathered and disseminated by the American Alliance of Museums. So they're coming from the field, and we just gather them all up and send them back out to you. And they're generally accepted levels that all museums can achieve. So the museum needs to be a good steward of its resources that are held in the public trust. It needs to demonstrate that it has a commitment to providing the public with physical and intellectual access to the museum and its resources. The museum, of course, needs to comply with local, state, and federal laws and any codes and regulations that might apply to its specific facilities, operations, and administration. It needs to allocate its space and use facilities to meet the needs of the collections, the audience, the staff, and take appropriate measures to ensure the safety and security of those people, the collections and objects and facilities that it owns and uses. And the museum also should have an effective program for the care and long-term maintenance of its facilities. The museum should be clean and well-maintained and provide for the visitor's needs, and should take appropriate measures to protect itself against potential risk and loss. And that's one of the major ones where the disaster plan comes in. And more specifically related to the plan itself, here are some of the required elements that every disaster plan should have. So keep in mind that every institution is different, and disaster plans should reflect that. But there are these several items that most, if not all, museums should include in their plans. The process of creating and implementing the plan is far more important and beneficial to the museum than the actual plan itself. Although the actual plan itself, when you need to use it, is extremely useful. So there is no one perfect template for any document, although there is, not something to be said for not reinventing the wheel. So do get some of those sample documents from the Information Center. If you are a Tier 3 museum, you can access those. And, keep in mind that the museum field is diverse, and each museum's document should be influenced by its own history, community, collections, and governments, etc. Interrelated policies and plans. So if you have codes of ethics and collections policies, and your disaster preparedness plan should all be related to one another. So always tailor your plan to your institution. Make sure that you review the challenges and keep thoughtful in your planning, and remember that you need to cover all the relevant risks to your institution. There are many that are in hurricane zones that need to have hurricane procedures, or in Tornado Alley that need to have tornado procedures, but not everyone has the same risks associated. You need to address all of these different things: your staff, your visitors, your structures, and your collections. They all need to be included in your plan. And have evacuation plans for both people and collections. You need to specify how you're going to protect, evacuate, or recover collections in the event of a disaster. And always make sure that your plan includes some sort of delegation of responsibility for implementation. Who's going to do what and when? And here are some typical steps to writing a disaster plan. Now, strong disaster plans are comprehensive, yet simple and flexible and easy to follow during an emergency. So if you have a huge document with just words upon words upon words, it's going to be less effective than bullet-pointed lists. You do this, you do this, you do this, and in a specific order. So in devising the plan, staff should work together, create a team of people who are going to include, different areas from the museum. If you have a larger staff, you can have, development people and security people and communications people and collections people all on the team developing the plan. And my fellow presenters, if you have any additional comments as we go through this list, please jump in at any point. Review the resources that are out there and available to you. Some that we are going to provide to you later on are very useful. In developing plans. So remember that you have a lot of options out there when you're writing the plan. Assess and document all of the various risks and hazards that might be applicable to your museum. So consider natural disasters, man-made threats, mechanical failures, those both major disasters and minor things that might happen to you. And always establish some preventative measures, steps that can be taken to prevent disasters or minimize the damage from them. In monitoring hazards, you can help prevent them from potentially morphing into really potential disasters. As Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Always prepare for disaster. Museums may find it helpful to determine what supplies are needed and inventory those supplies and label them and make them accessible and make sure that the staff knows where those materials are stored. And also, make sure that you have the staff information, the contact information for your staff and possibly your board that will help the staff communicate and respond during the disaster. It might be helpful to identify and establish relationships with suppliers and collaborators before disaster strikes. Offering tours of the museum to those disaster professionals might help them become familiar with the facilities. Take risk management measures. As a risk management measure, it may be wise to make duplicates of important records, store them off-site, and possibly make duplicates of keys, things like that.
Cecilia, I'd like to jump in for a second and
Sure.
say, in terms of establishing contacts within your museum, that you need to build in some redundancy and alternate plans, because there are times when someone in your chain of command won't be available or can't get to the museum.
Yeah.
So it's good to do that. And in terms of supplies, you can have cooperative agreements with museums in your region or even outside your state to take collections before the disaster, or to help you store the collections after the disaster. Museums that are near each other can get together and share supplies.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, exactly.
And it's always a good idea to talk to your local fire department. Many fire departments will give you a lock box, have a metal box that can be on the outside of your building that they would have a key to, that would open up, allow them to have a key to get into your facility. The last thing you want is the fire department to axe their way through your front door because the smoke alarm went off. So it's talking with the local fire department, police department, town and county emergency preparedness folks. Let them know what your plans are up to and know how your plan will fit in with the local emergency plans.
Exactly. Those are great examples. Thank you. And also good to establish a chain of command, as I was saying earlier. Make sure that people know where they're supposed to be, who's in charge at what point in time.
And the director usually is the voice of the museum. If someone is calling the museum what has happened, what's the damage, there should be one voice, and it's usually the director or their designate, so they don't get too many people telling too many things.
Good point. That's great. Yeah, that's a great point. And always have that one point person who's in charge of the emergency preparation and coordination.
I learned something very interesting during our workshops here in Florida, that if you use the model of establishing an incident command center, that the head of the incident command center is the first person to arrive on the scene, which surprised me. I thought it would be somebody that you had appointed, but it's the first person that comes. That person can be changed later, but in the very beginning, it's that first person. So
whoever gets there first is the coordinator. Well, that's
which is why everyone should be trained. You should have redundancy in your training. You just can't rely on your buildings, your facility use manager to know where the electrical shutoffs are. Everyone should know how to shut down electricity if need be.
Right.
Yeah, training is essential to preparedness for a disaster, absolutely. So you also want to develop your techniques and the time frame, and that is also where training comes in. And, you want to review and revise the plan often, and always, practice, practice, practice.
Cecilia, I'd just like to chime in and say we will be covering some of these in a little more detail later on. I know I'm going to be speaking to some of that we just talked about.
Correct. Absolutely. Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about actually using the plan now when you need to implement it. Let's have a little audience question here. Who can tell me if the emergency plan can be used as a strategic planning tool, a tool for grant writing, a tool for risk assessment, all of the above and more? This isn't even a hard question. Everybody gets it right. You're right. Everybody, it can be used for all of those things.
Great to see how quickly those answers popped in here.
Thank you. And Doug is going to tell us a little bit about how an emergency plan can be used as a strategic planning tool.
Well, it can be used for decision making. If you're doing even doing renovations to your building, building a new building, what to collect, having in mind what the potential dangers and threats are, would help you in deciding new construction. If you, for example, if you were in an earthquake-prone area, obviously you want the building to be able to take an earthquake. If you are along the water like we are in the Chesapeake Bay, then you want to be able to handle flooding situations. So sometimes when you get into strategic planning and you're just involved in thinking about the site and the museum and how to run a museum, you forget about those type of natural and man-made disasters that can occur. And to manage risk. And being prepared. The photograph there shows here at the Calvert Marine Museum, we have plastic sheeting pre-cut to cover everything, ready to go. And when we've had to put our plans into place, everyone comes in and helps out and covers. Even the director gets covered.
And Doug, let me ask you: the folks who are doing this, are they staff, volunteers, combination of both?
It's mostly staff. Some volunteers are used, but we have a very comprehensive team set up, and they review our plans each year, go through them, look at our supplies, and need to check every year because sometimes that duct tape disappears over the winter before you check it in the spring before the hurricane season starts. So it's training, and again, it's multiple training for redundancy, that people from one team can go on to another team, depending on the different areas that team is trained for, whether it's an exhibit building, outdoors. We have boat collections, live animals, and so forth. So we have lots of areas to cover here.
Great.
One of the things that we do, Doug, is we inventory our supplies at the beginning in May, before hurricane season starts, because you're right, those things walk no matter how many signs you have on them. Emergency use only, somebody else uses them for something.
Yeah, it's the same here. I'll just borrow this rope. I'll just borrow this duct tape.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also a good idea to include those types of things, like how often you will inventory those supplies in your disaster plan.
Yeah, at least annually, if not more often.
So now Elise is going to take us through using the plan as a risk assessment tool.
Okay, and before I talk about that, I'd like to address just briefly the questions about integrating with the university. I have a couple examples later on, and I'm also happy to talk about it with those people who have questions. I'll type in my email address in just a minute, and I'd be happy to talk to people after the webinar about that issue, because this is certainly something the Florida Museum of Natural History is part of the University of Florida, and we do have to integrate with the university with our emergency plan. So now back to using the emergency plan as a risk assessment tool. The first thing that you do before you write the plan is identify the risks and possible threats to your institution. You can't draft the plan before you know what you need to respond to. If you do, the plan will end up not being functional for your institution. Once the potential risks and threats are identified, you can develop the emergency response and mitigation procedures specific to your institution, to your collections, and to your personnel. And it's these specific procedures that will help to minimize damage from your risks and your threats. Regularly scheduled reviews of the disaster plan should also prompt the museum to review and update its risk assessment. In terms of assessing the collection, you can use the disaster plan, the development of the plan, to assess your collections. What's the highest priority for protection and salvage? What objects are lower priority? You can use answers to these questions to develop procedures that will adequately protect your own resources. How are you going to deal with something that's too heavy to move, for example? We have a history museum here in Florida that has a calliope. The majority of their staff are elderly volunteers, and they cannot move that object. So they have a procedure for protecting it in place. The lack of a plan, pardon the pun, can spell disaster for a museum. So failure to plan adequately to protect your museum can prevent or does not prevent the annihilation of a museum's collection or destruction of the building or loss of income. For example, if you depend on people paying to enter the museum, you can lose that income, that source of income, if you have to close for an extended period of time. So failure to have a plan to protect against these sorts of things can lead to permanent closure of the museum. I'm going to turn it back over to Cecilia now.
Thank you, Elise. That was very well said. And I think Doug is going to take us through using the plan as a communications tool.
Well, the question is, who do you want to communicate with? You have your staff, your board, volunteers, the public, and visitors. So in putting your plan together, you want to get all these groups to get their input. And during an emergency, it's good to have a command center, usually the director or their designate, to coordinate the staff to carry out the plan. And in the photograph here I am with my secretary. We're going through our plan, and the different teams are out working on their sections. They'll report back in, telling us when different tasks have been completed. And sometimes a team may be short-handed. You can transfer people around, but keeping an eye, one person, one group on track of all the activities going on. And communications can sometimes go down. You can't rely on landlines, cell phones, radios, walkie-talkies. You need to have all those kinds of things available. We'll have walkie-talkies and just to work around the grounds because sometimes the cell phone tower goes down or the landlines go down. And also are communicating, again, with the local emergency centers. We have a Calvert County, a county emergency control center, as well as communicating with the fire department, the police, state and local police. And being that central control station, then staff can come to say, gee, we're out of supplies, we need some specialized equipment, we need food and drink, we're thirsty. And if an emergency happens, a fire or a bomb threat or whatnot, again, it's communicating with the public and the visitors. How do we get them out in a safe way? In our plan, we talk about if the alarms go off, staff sweeping areas, make sure there's no visitors stuck in a bathroom or in a certain area, that everyone is out of the building if we need to evacuate the building. So communications is very important between the staff, between the community, among yourselves.
And Doug, this is Greg. Before we move on, I wonder if you might take a moment to address a couple of questions that have come in. One from Art in Arizona, who talks about working with your local emergency management office. I'm guessing that you have done that in your years at the Calvert Marine Museum.
Yes, we are a county facility, but the local county emergency center will work with any of the nonprofits. Such as a hurricane, we'll get up-to-date hurricane and weather information emailed to us. We've worked with them to where can we get supplies. We even done planning that if a section of our building was damaged, we've already figured out what other facilities we would need, how much office space we'd need, how many computers we would need, what are the essential activities that the museum would have to keep going, even if our building was down for any length of time. So there's professional emergency planners out there that you can sit down and talk with. You're not just by yourself, and they want to work with you.
And Doug, since you're a county facility, maybe Josh's question about integration with a larger local government complex, maybe you could talk about how that works for you in the county system.
Well, I think it works well for us. I assume that if you're part of another complex, that if it is not already set up that you are meeting with all the other, we have library, arts centers, and so forth, then take the initiative to call a meeting together and say, we're all putting plans together. We all need to know what each one's doing. And either your local town or state has a emergency coordinator at this point in government, how governments work, and help them coordinate it. And I see here about don't forget historic animals at historic sites, or not even non-historic animals. We have a 15-tank aquarium. We have a small aquarium, and we have live river otter. And I can assume the same thing if you have a historic site, if you have horses or cows or pigs or whatnot. You need to think ahead of time. where can we move those animals to a safer location if that's the place? Or is there a safe place on the site if a storm is coming in? We're looking as to where we can transfer our river otter to a safe location. We haven't exactly figured that out. And even thought about the thing that in some of our tanks we have invasive species. We are displaying creatures that we don't want in the bay, and that part of our plan is if we were going to get slammed and we were going to have everything overflowed, we would euthanize those invasive animals, the fish and whatnot, and the crabs, so they couldn't get into the Chesapeake environment, which is what we don't want to do. So it's even thinking along that line.
Great, Doug. Thanks very much for taking a few minutes to answer some of those questions. And for those of you in the audience, this is a great reminder for you. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to type them in your chat box, and we'll try to get them as we go along.
Greg, this is Elise. I'd like to take a minute to explain how we interact with both the local community emergency agencies and the university. We're a large museum, so we have several building emergency coordinators, and that's how we interconnect with the university's emergency manager. So we have communication between the emergency manager and what we call the BECs, the building emergency coordinators. There's another program here, and it's a national program. It's called CERT, Community Emergency Response Team. And several of the building emergency coordinators here are part of the local CERT team. And that's one of the ways that we interact with the local city and county emergency agencies.
Wow. Thank you, Elise. All right, we're going to move on to talk about how the disaster preparedness plan fits in with your specific museum's operation. So it's very important to make sure that your plan is meeting the needs of your entire institution, including the facilities, the financial recovery, the collections, the exhibitions, the people, all of these different areas. And all of your documentation should speak to one another consistently and comprehensively to support your museum's mission. And then remember that it's important for everyone that's associated with the museum to be involved in the creation and implementation of the document. They need to have buy-in to ensure that everything will go smoothly in the event of a disaster. And again, train, train, train.
And many times we concentrate on the people and the things, the objects, but the financial aspect of it is important. If you rely on admissions or rely on your store sales to help balance your budget every year, and think about, well, what happens if my museum store is shut down for a month? Now, you can get business interruption insurance, and sometimes the premiums on that is worthwhile if to cover that potential financial disaster if your store was out of business for a month.
That's a great thing to think about when you're developing the plan. Thanks, Doug. So, Elise, can you talk to us a little bit about who was included in the process, who should be included in the process?
Hey, I'd love to. I think we've all kind of figured out that a good plan protects the entire museum. So in developing and writing the plan, it's beneficial to have all functional areas of the museum represented on that committee or team. In devising the plan, those who work on the team can work together to gather information regarding the institution, the collection, and any potential threats in order to outline the preventive measures and develop emergency response procedures. So the more integrated the disaster plan, the more usable will be those operating procedures. So first of all, it's important to have the director or his or her authorized representative. And that is important because that person is the museum's leader. It's the person with ultimate administrative and fiscal responsibility and authority. The next set of people that you want to have involved are the collection staff. And this is because they know the collections. They know them well enough to assign priority levels for protection and salvage. They can identify the risks and threats to which the collections are exposed. And they know what measures need to be taken to protect the collections and what procedures are necessary to salvage the collections should that become necessary. There's other kinds of staff that need to be involved. And examples include things like the exhibit director, the facilities manager, the head of security, personnel manager, the volunteer coordinator, visitor services, the gift shop manager, the fiscal manager, and even a member of custodial staff. Of course, that's not everyone, but that's an example of the types of staff that should be included. Your board members can be included too. Often they can help with identifying the possible risks and threats. They may be able to provide access to necessary resources such as supplies and services. They may have contact with local, regional, and state emergency agencies. One of the museums here in Florida, one of their board members is connected to the local utility company, and that person has been able to get the museum on the utility company's list of organizations with the highest priority for restoration of utilities after a disaster. So that board member has been very influential in the success of that museum's disaster plan and recovering from a disaster. Volunteers are also important. For many museums, especially small museums, volunteers make up the majority of the workforce, and they're integral to the operation of the museum. They sometimes know more about certain aspects of the museum than the staff does. For example, which collections objects need special attention, which activities are being conducted in a safe manner, where there might be a problem within the building, like a broken light fixture or a door that won't close properly. So you can see that they're also integral to the development of the plan. Then there are people outside your organization. For example, and we've brought this up earlier, representatives from the local, regional, and state emergency response agencies, representatives from the local fire company, and especially the station that will be responding to your museum. In terms of universities or museums with parent organizations, you want to include people from your emergency management division. So as I've said here on the University of Florida campus, we are a part of the University of Florida, so we can coordinate with the university's environmental health and safety department. We do have our own emergency plan, but that plan has to interconnect with the broader university's plan. So that is one way that we interconnect with the university here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Cecilia.
Thank you, Elise. That was wonderful, especially including all of those outside resources in the development of the plan. I think that's very important. And Doug is going to talk to us about who the plan has been shared with, as opposed to who's creating it. Who are you sharing it with once it is complete?
Well, as some of the same folks that are involved in developing the plan, there's the board, and normally you would have a board member on the development of the plan, of course the staff, the volunteers. And both staff and volunteers should review the plan, and they may not have been the initial group that was putting the document together, but they may find something that the initial group missed. Again, visitors and getting visitors' input is always important. And as we've touched on before, emergency planners. And then we've got this other category, others. And a group I never knew existed showed up on my doorstep about a week ago. They called me. They're local ham radio operators. And this is a group that works with emergency planners, so when there's a disaster and other forms of communications are down, the ham radio operators come together. And they're actually going to meet at my museum in a couple of weeks. They're going to be here for 24 hours, and they're going to do emergency training as if there was an emergency going on. They bring their equipment. They're going to set it up on the museum grounds. set up temporary antenna, have their own generators as if there was no local electricity, and they'll be working for 24 hours straight as if they were working in an emergency situation. So there's a group I never knew existed that would certainly be a wonderful group to have to help communicate with the outside world.
Oh, that's great, Doug. And they came to you, did they?
Yeah, ham radio operators, we ham it up here. So moving on.
Moving on. Elise is going to talk about why it's important to review and revise your plan.
Okay, and before I do that, I'd like to address Rachel's question about having multiple buildings at different locations. The way that we address this, we do not have a separate plan for each building. We have a separate sub-plan within the overall plan. We do address each building separately, but it's part of our overall plan. We don't have, 5 different plans, say. But it is important when developing a plan to consider all of your facilities, off-site storage, multiple historic buildings that are part of your historic house, all of the different parts of your museum are important. So now, go ahead.
And that's the same here with us, that we have our central 9-acre campus, but a quarter of a mile away we have a historic oyster canning facility, which is on the water, and 10 miles north we have an operating lighthouse. And so it's part of our overall plan that the different teams we have will go out to those sites. There's specific jobs that need to be done to secure those sites to be ready for a storm or emergency, but again, is part of the overall plan because it all has to integrate together.
Good, thanks, Doug. Now, in terms of review and revision, of course, we know that museum policies and plans are living documents, and especially an emergency plan. It is useless if it's outdated or if it's ignored. Now, an emergency plan, I think, should be reviewed at the minimum annually. We review, as I said, our plan in May before the beginning of the hurricane season because that's one of the major threats that we're exposed to. That review includes updating contacts and contact information and checking to make sure that the contact information for any suppliers identified in the plan are current. Do we have any new collections items that need to be reviewed or that need special care or attention? We update and revise the collections priority list at that time if it's necessary. We also review the institutional risk assessment. Has anything changed? Do we have a new building? Have we vacated a building? Do we have any problems with our main structure? And if we find anything at that time that needs to be revised, we revise the plan. And then we circulate that new plan to everyone in the museum. The plan should be reviewed also or updated if the institution undergoes any radical change like renovation or construction, even if that event falls before the time of the regular update. If personnel change, personnel involved with the plan, like someone in the chain of command leaves or changes positions, if someone in the regional, local, state emergency agencies change, we have, if our emergency manager here on campus changes, then we need to coordinate with that person. We need to enter that new information into the plan. It's essential for us to have a close connection to the emergency manager because that person informs us of any changes in the university's emergency procedures, which we then have to incorporate into our museum plan. Another time to review or update your plan would be if organization standards change or if professional standards change, like standards for collection storage, for example. Periodic review and revision also means practicing the plan, and I cannot emphasize that enough. conducting drills and acting out scenarios. Those exercises allow the museum to evaluate the plan, what went right, what went wrong, and to revise and develop new procedures to address any issues or problems that were encountered during the exercise. The plan should also be reviewed and updated after the museum experiences an emergency or goes through a disaster. Again, review what worked, what didn't work. Did people's cell phones work? Did the chain of command work? Were supplies adequate? Were resources identified in the plan available and in a timely fashion? Did people know what their roles in the plan were well enough to react calmly and efficiently? Discuss how to do things better and more efficiently the next time and come up with solutions to any problems encountered, then revise and update your plan. Back to Cecilia.
Thank you, Elise. Doug is going to take us through the continual planning cycle.
Well, Elise really kind of hit a lot of these points that before, during, and after, you should be reviewing your plan, taking notes down of what you've done, what worked, what didn't work. And you also need to remember that you just can't take for granted that the day after the storm or right after the emergency is ended, that the world is going to be the same, that you'll be able to go out and buy gas or plywood or generators or pumps, etc., because everybody else is going to be out there looking for the same things. So to be able to stockpile equipment, gasoline, generators, all these things ready to go is so important, because you need to be somewhat self-sufficient and self-reliant. Because if it's a major disaster like the New Jersey coast with Sandy, you're not going to necessarily be the main focus point for local emergency planners to help. And we can move on to the next photo. Next slide. Well, this is here at the Marine Museum, and when you do have the luxury of getting ready for a storm, and many times with hurricanes, you have a couple of days to plenty hours. Here we have pre-cut plywood. Has all been labeled and stored and ready to go, and making the connections here. This is a cherry picker truck from the local county government. We used to do this by ladder, which was a lot harder on their backs. So again, having the time to make these decisions to get yourself prepared, and of course, if it's a tornado or earthquake, there's nothing you can do to prepare for that except for getting ready for the after effects. But and also here's this shot here shows what we don't normally have in Maryland, but was a mini tornado. We had a tornado that came off the river, which is across the field from the museum, and hit this visitor center, which was across the street. And my staff went into emergency mode. They immediately went over with tarps and hammers and ladders and secured the building. And again, no one was pulling out a plan. It was just we kind of knew instinctively what to do. And the next slide shows across the street there, the tornado missed the museum, skipped through the visitor center, and hit the fence. And I found it kind of interesting looking at this photo. You can see just to the left, there's one of my direction signs, Calvert Marine Museum, that the tornado took the fence out but didn't touch the sign, which I think is another reason to know that God loves museums.
Thank you, Doug. And now we have a quick audience question for you. What are some of the strategies that you have used in your institution in writing your own disaster preparedness and emergency plan? And has that worked for your organization? You can either type directly into the little box on the question here, or you can type in the chat box as you've been doing throughout.
Cecilia, while people are doing that, I'd like to make a comment in response to Art Carlton's comment about an important reason to have an emergency plan. One of the museums here in Florida serves as a shelter. And so that's another part that they have to incorporate into their plan. And it's another way that they help the community return to normalcy after a hurricane or flooding or tornado. We do have those occasionally here too. So again, another reason why museums are important in helping the whole community.
Great, yeah. And I see that Rachel Carson also asked a question about how often the plan should be practiced. Do you have any comments on that, Elise or Greg?
You know, that's a good question because the way we practice our plan here is we have enough things happen that we use those occasions as practices or, we're actually responding to the emergency. We have fire drills here on campus. We use those as a drill. They're run by the university, but each building has its own period. And after the fire drill is over, we assess what has happened and revise the plan if we need to. We have active shooter and responding to violent personnel practice drills, again, organized by the university. So because we're part of a university, we get a lot of chances to practice. I would say for smaller museums or museums that don't have parent organizations, you need to make that decision for yourself. How much is it going to impact time doing other things? It's very important to practice the plan, but you do have to strike that balance. It is going to take a day away from other activities. You are going to have to use some of your resources that might have to be replaced. So financially, it might be a little bit of a hardship. But I would say really, it's not, I'm not trying to skirt the question, but it's really up to the individual institution. How often do you practice your plan?
Yeah, I agree.
And we've been talking about big disasters and big problems, but we also need to think about the everyday. And here we many of the staff, frontline and even the offices, have first aid training, CPR training, AED training, and recently we even did fire extinguisher training. Now we all know there's the fire extinguisher on the wall. You know, you're supposed to take it off, pull the pin, and use it. Well, how many people have actually done it? Well, we at least about every 2 years, we set something on fire and we have people stand in line and we all get to use a fire extinguisher. And again, it's sometimes our training is we talk about what we would do, but when it actually comes down to it, you need to, to break the glass, to pull the thing out, to grab the fire hose, to grab the fire axe. It's a little disconcerting, especially when that alarm is going off. The fire alarm is beeping in your ear, and you're trying to keep a steady sense of mind as you're trying to clear the building and make sure all the school kids are out.
Yeah. And I see in some of the responses that we've had to our question, I see Dana Dunn at the Guild Museum says that they went through a wind disaster, and that taught them a great deal. I'm hoping that they maybe incorporated some of that into their plan, so that next time they know exactly how to handle the situation.
And also, Holly at the Old Economy Village says they have emergency barrels on dollies ready to go with supplies not used for any other times, and they check those every once in a while. What sounds a little bit like your fire extinguisher drill, Doug.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We do the same. We have the fire extinguisher training too, but we have special places for our emergency supplies that we don't store other supplies. And, it might just be a little corner of the room, or my first aid kit's on one corner of my bookshelf, and it's always there, and there's a big pink sign that says it's there.
And this is Cecilia. When I was at the National Building Museum, we had a big rolly bin. basically, that had all our emergency supplies that we could just roll it out to wherever we needed it to be.
Well, I like Randy's response from the Center for History. He says at one museum I worked, we had custom-made shutters that were historically accurate that had Miami-Dade hurricane panels on them, so they could be closed during a hurricane. So they were functional and aesthetic at the same time. Yeah. And some of the other comments I'm seeing, folks are saying that they compare examples from other museums, which is, I think, a very useful thing to do. But I think, Elise, you might have said this earlier, it all depends on your institution. You can compare, but it really needs to be tailored to your own institution.
And I see Veronica from Denver writes about on-site hazardous materials identification and the storage of flammable liquids, paints, solvents, all this sort of thing. It's important to have these things stored properly to prevent the fire or the disaster. So it's being aware of these kinds of things that are on your site that could blow up in your face.
You know, Doug, it's not only efficient to do that, but it's legally required. There are legal requirements for storing hazardous material. So, another comment I wanted to make, I didn't want it to seem like, you know, I'm part of a university. I have a lot of resources at hand on the university campus for training. But you can go to your local emergency agencies, your local fire department, your the CERT team if you have one, and they will help you get this training as well. It's not something that's inaccessible to smaller museums or volunteer-run museums.
So I think that's a pretty good segue into our next topic, which is basically I'm just going to ask our two presenters, Elise and Doug, a couple of questions about how they have gone about actually developing or revising a disaster plan, or how they have used their plan in an emergency situation. So specifically, Elise, who did you include in your development of your plan?
We have a rather large team when they do that. As I said, we're a large museum with many different divisions. We have various collections divisions. We have a butterfly rainforest. We have all of the exhibit and public programs areas. And so our team can get a little bit large. We include a representative from the director's office. I'm the head of the Health and Safety Committee, so I'm always involved. We involve certain members of the Health and Safety Committee if they wish to be on that team. Few of our building emergency coordinators, our facilities managers, the visitor center people, or not visitor center, but visitor services people, and our volunteer coordinator, because we have a large volunteer staff, and we want to make sure people are taken care of. Visitor services, because we also have large visitation, and we need to include them in the plan, how to deal with the visitors. Little off topic here for a second. We also try to perform drills and practices during times of heavy visitation. So during times when we have school kids in the museum, in the exhibits. So that's who we include in our plan.
And do you find that including all of those people in the development of the policy, did it help improve other aspects of the museum's operations, or did it change your relationship with any of those individuals?
You know, that's a great question, because it really does. It makes us look at maybe activities that we didn't know were going on in the exhibits department, say. I discovered through one of these processes that hazardous waste weren't being handled properly over in the exhibits department. So we got that fixed. And that our shop personnel, not the gift shop, but the construction shop, they weren't getting the training that they needed. So it definitely has helped us. And every time we review and revise the plan, we we address another area that we didn't address very well the last time.
That's great. So, Doug, I know that you have actually lived through a couple of emergency situations in your museum, as has Elise, but I'm going to focus on Doug for a second. Was it clear when you were going through these situations who was in charge during the response?
Yeah, I think we've trained enough and we've thought about enough that when something happens, people just go into the mode and don't sit around thinking, well, who's going to make the decision? An example was there was a storm coming up the Chesapeake, which kept being downgraded from a storm to a tropical depression. And on the Friday night of Labor Day weekend, we were hit with a tropical depression, Ernesto. And so no one thought about, well, we don't need to go into emergency gear and call everybody in. But many of us came in on Saturday morning just to check on things, and we were quite pleased that there was very little flooding. There was a few branches down, that the wind wasn't too bad. But we happened to go into our administration building, which would have been closed without anyone in it for the 3-day weekend. And something happened to go in there, and we'd look down in the basement level, and the floor was all shining. It was all full of water. What had happened was the storm had caused the local sewer pumping station to malfunction, and it backed up through the floor drains, and we had 30,000 gallons of water in our building. And so we went into our emergency mode. We brought out the gasoline pumps that we had, and of course it wouldn't work. Couldn't get it to go, but we got the fire department to come, and they pumped out 30,000 gallons of water. We had to rip up the carpeting. Basically, it took 6 months to get this area back up again. We had the guys with the moon suits and everything. But I think that having gone through training about worrying about a hurricane and what would happen with that it allowed us to tackle this emergency that came completely out of the blue. And of course, we were so proud of ourselves when we renovated this building. We knew the floor drains were there, and we said, well, let's leave the floor drains because the sprinkler system may go off in the middle of the night and it'll drain it out of the building, never dreaming the water would come up through the floor drain. And of course, we have a check valve system now to handle that. But whatever you plan for, it's going to get you. It's just, I remember an AAM conference I attended where they were talking to colleagues from Charleston, historic houses that were worried about storm surges because the hurricanes had hit the coast before, and the storm was coming, and everyone moved all their furniture up to the second floor so they wouldn't worry about flooding, and all the roofs came off and everything got wet on the second floor. So no matter what you do, it can come around and bite you. But it's being prepared for it and not letting it get you.
And it sounds like training really helped because everyone just kind of went into that mode.
Went into mode, yeah.
Knew what to do, regardless of whether they had planned for that specific emergency or not.
Yeah, where the supplies were, where the tools were. You didn't say, oh, gee, Bob's the only one with the key to that room, sort of thing. So.
Thank you. Elise, do you have anything to add to that, responding to a disaster?
We have the same sort of incidents or examples here. We've done so many things here. We've had a period of construction, renovation here in our one building, and we got very used to responding to leaks from the pipes. And again, we've just been through it so many times that no matter who's here, we know how to respond. And as Doug said, we just sort of go into automatic mode. We know where the supplies are. One of the problems that we have is not in the response, but during the drill is getting people to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And we do have people who won't leave during the fire drills. So, and that's the director's responsibility then to make sure that people know they're supposed to leave and any ramifications for them not leaving.
Yeah, I think that is useful to make everyone aware of how important those drills are and how disasters and emergencies can happen without notice. So it's important to know what to do right off the bat.
And so for all of you, this is Greg, these kinds of drills and activities that you're talking about would live explicitly in a disaster preparedness plan.
Exactly. It should be outlined specifically in the planning document.
Right.
So let's move on and talk about some of the resources that you all can use in developing or revising your own plans. Of course, there are the national standards and best practices for U.S. museums. In plain English, the ones that apply to facilities and risk management, which is where the emergency management issues live, are don't crowd people or things, make it safe to visit your museum or work there, keep it clean, keep the toilet paper stocked, and if all else fails, know where the exit is and make sure it is clearly marked.
And Cecilia, this is Greg again. Just to remind folks that when we talk about the standards, these are not AAM's standards or the Alliance's standards. Cecilia, you mentioned this at the beginning. These are standards that are developed with, for, and by the field at large over a long period of time.
Yes, absolutely. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the core documents verification program, of which the disaster plan is one of the core documents, is part of our new continuum of excellence. And this is a multi-program structure that offers opportunities for museums to enter at various levels for assessment, feedback, and recognition. And they build one upon the other. So the entrance point would be membership. You move up through the Pledge of Excellence, and you can do museum assessment program at any point along the continuum. You see it there in two places, but you can really do it at any time. And core documents verification is, right smack dab in the middle. If you have all those policies and plans in place, apply for core documents. It's a great way to get that recognition for those professional documents, and then you can move on into accreditation.
And Cecilia, do you want to talk just a moment about the Pledge of Excellence and what that means for many of our institutions?
Certainly. The Pledge of Excellence is a very easy thing that you can do to just make a statement to the field that you are committed to striving for excellence, to meeting the standards, and showing that you are a professional museum in the museum field. And all you have to do is go on the AAM website and click a button that says you will take the Pledge of Excellence and strive to meet these standards.
Great. Thanks very much, Cecilia.
Thank you, Greg. There are several resources that we have on the Alliance website that can help you specifically in preparing for and revising your disaster preparedness plan. Two of them are listed here: the Disaster Preparedness Activity and the Alliance Reference Guide on Developing a Disaster Preparedness Emergency Response Plan. And those are both available free to anyone. You go to the Alliance website, go to assessment programs, core documents verification, and then core documents, and you will see these various guides ready and available for each of the 5 core documents, not just the emergency plan.
Right, and just to point out that each, as you said, each of these core documents have a whole range of these resources that are available to anyone on the website. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah. And it's a really great way to start working on your documents and preparing for core documents verification.
Great. And I know you're all going to be at the annual meeting later this month, yeah?
Hopefully.
I hope so.
Yeah, we're all excited about it. We've got some great things planned for the annual meeting. On Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we are having core document review clinics in the convention center from 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. Just send me a quick email I'll put my email in the chat box in just a moment. And let me know that you're interested in having one of your documents reviewed by a professional peer reviewer who has extensive experience in reviewing documents. And they'll give you some feedback on one of these 5 core documents.
Thanks, Cecilia. And as many of you know, this program that you're engaging in today is the second in a series of 5 webinars on core documents verification. The next one coming up is June 19th on the Institutional Code of Ethics. And then we take a little break for the summer and come back in September to talk about the importance of your mission statement, followed up in November by the institutional plan. Cecilia, anything else you want to say about those particular programs coming up?
I think that they will be just as informative and useful as the 2 that we've already done now. We've done collections policy and emergency planning. And I think, Greg, can you confirm that the recorded collections policy webinar will be available at some point?
Yes, it will be. In fact, anyone who participated in the collections management policy webinar already has access to that recording, and for anyone who didn't participate in that, it will be available in our online library, which should be going live shortly after the annual meeting. We're aligning it with our new database and our new content management system.
Great. So potentially you could have a set of all 5 of the recorded webinars at some point in the future as a reference tool for you to use in revising all of these documents.
Right, and we also will, referencing that online library, there are other programs that we already have archived on Preparing for Disaster, which is a great program that talks about emergency response teams and building emergency response communities. We have a program on water and works on paper and planning for crisis communications. So those are some other resources available or will be soon available.
And we also have several disaster planning resources in our Alliance bookstore online. The Disaster Response Wheel, the Field Guide to Emergency Response, and Edwards Disaster Recovery Directory are just a few of the resources there. And there are also additional resources out there on the web that you can locate. Building an emergency plan through the Getty is a very useful tool to use when you are creating your disaster plan. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the emergency response wheel has now become the Emergency and Salvage app, which is free. And if you just Google Emergency Response Wheel free app, you can find it, but it's on the Heritage Preservation website, and I had included that link earlier in the chat box.
Well, and I know that not everybody has a smartphone. I'm recently migrated from my Jitterbug phone, as my friends like to say, but I think this ERS app is a terrific addition and a great tool for those people who do have a smartphone.
This is Elise. I see that Daniel mentions another great resource, the National Park Service Museum Handbook, and that can be found on the National Park Service Museum Management website. If you just type that into your search engine, you'll find the web link.
Absolutely, Elise, thank you.
And thanks, Daniel, for letting us know about that. And I just want to take a moment to point out for any of you who are already museum members, Alliance Museum members, you may know of the many benefits of different tiers. And my colleagues here at AAM wanted me to remind all of you that all museum members, tier 3, 2, and 1, receive an e-version of the National Standards book, as well as an e-version of our Speak Up for Museums advocacy publication. And if you are interested in learning more about Alliance membership, you could contact any one of us. But there's plenty of great information on the website to help you know more about membership. And Cecilia, do you want to talk a little bit about the Information Center?
Absolutely. The Alliance Information Center is a wonderful resource for museums overall. any tier gets access to, or I guess individual tier 1 or tier 2 and tier 3 get access to the online resources, and tier 3 gets access to 1,000 sample documents by request and customized research services. So a lot of useful information coming from the Information Center.
And I want to pause and take notice of Esther's question about the ERP app being available for Android users. I don't know the answer to that, but if you go to the heritagepreservation.org website, you'll find a little bit more information about their emergency and salvage app. And I'm assuming that there would be a place for you to learn more about other applicability for that.
Great, thank you, Greg. And this is a great opportunity for any final questions that people have had floating around, but they haven't had a chance to type into the chat box. So please feel free to go ahead and do that now. And while everyone is doing that, I'm going to take a quick moment here to launch an evaluation link in the top left-hand corner of the screen. So as we start to wind down for today, we'd love if you could just click that yellow evaluation button, which will launch a survey in your web browser, and your feedback on today's webinar is much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Adam. And I was just reflecting a little bit on some of the comments that came in earlier about people in their institutions partnering with various historical and cultural entities and civic entities. Elise and Doug, wondering if there's anything you want to add to that. It seems to be a pretty important component of emergency preparedness and disaster planning.
This is Elise. We've said it several times during the webinar today, but just reiterate that it's really, really important to interconnect with your local agencies outside your museum. They have a lot of resources available. They can give you training. They can help you with developing your plan so that it will be useful. It's just that cooperation is really important.
Yeah, meeting with your local fire department and walking them through your facility. One thing, they may see something that is a potential fire hazard you hadn't thought of, and plus, if they're showing up in the middle of the night, they want to know how to get around and do the least amount of damage while they're trying to save your facility if you have a problem.
We have an interesting footnote to that. We did have the fire department tour the building here, our collection storage building. We have large alcohol collections, that is specimens preserved in alcohol, which is what we and the state fire marshal were concerned about.